The ground did not look like a graveyard. There were no marble headstones, no polished angels, no carved names or dates, just a lumpy stretch of earth under a gray Ohio sky, wind rattling through bare trees, the kind of place you could drive past 100 times and never really see. But on that cold morning, a small group of people stood in a rough circle, staring down at a patch of ground that had been marked with bright spray paint. A backhoe waited nearby. A forensic tech shifted their weight, breath fogging in the air. Somewhere, under that dirt, under decades of silence and bureaucratic neglect, a girl had been buried without a name. No flowers, no family, no marker, just a number. Somewhere in that crowd, someone knew this was the last step in a very long chain of choices. Choices to ignore, to misfile, to misspell. Choices that took a living, breathing teenage girl and turned her into a case number in a potter's field. The engine of the backhoe rumbled to life. Before the first scoop of earth was taken, before the bones of a murdered girl were pulled from the ground for the second time, this story really began in a quieter place. A library. You are watching Disturbed Intent. If you are new here, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep digging into stories like this one, where a stranger's obsession and a simple clerical error decide whether someone is remembered or erased. In a dim corner of the Cleveland State University Library, a young woman sat hunched over a stack of aging cemetery records. The pages were thin, yellowed, and fragile. The ink faded in places, the handwriting looping and archaic. To most people, it would have looked like a graveyard of paper. To Christina Skates, it felt like a living map of the dead. She traced her fingers slowly down a column of names, lips moving silently as she read. This was her world. Burial logs, death certificates, indexes of people who used to be. For most students, genealogy was a dry assignment, something to endure for a grade. For Christina, it was different. These were not just records, they were lives, they were stories. At least, they were supposed to be. Her eyes moved down one page and then stopped. 3 words: white female bones. No name, no next of kin, no cause of death, just those 3 words and a number. Woman 82483. Christina frowned, leaning closer, as if a second look might summon details that were not there. She was used to gaps, dates that did not quite match, illegible handwriting, missing middle initials. The dead are rarely neat, and the paper trail they leave behind is often even messier. But this felt different. This was not sloppy penmanship or a missing birthday. This was an erasure. A person reduced to a generic description and an inventory number. White female bones. Woman 82483. Buried, it said, in a potter's field. No marker. She sat back in her chair, the old wood creaking beneath her. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was one of those countless unidentified remains that never get a name. Maybe somewhere, in some other file or database, there was more information. And yet, the words clung to her. White, female, bones. She looked around the reading room. Other students were tapping at laptops, scrolling on their phones, flipping pages. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The world went on, oblivious. Whoever she was, woman 82483 was not supposed to matter anymore. Her story had been quietly filed away and left to decay, just like the paper in front of Christina. But some people are not built to walk away. Christina reached for her phone. The cemetery's number was listed at the top of the records. She dialed, pressing the phone to her ear, feeling that strange mix of nerves and determination that hits right before you do something you know is going to change your day, if not your life. The line rang. A woman picked up. Christina explained what she had found, the entry number, the brief description, her own curiosity. She was polite, careful, the way you always are when you are asking for help from an institution that is under no real obligation to give it. The answer, when it came, was worse than she expected. They did not know. No name, no family, no additional notes, no investigation still open. Just a burial in an unmarked mass grave. Paperwork processed, matter closed. Whatever had happened to this woman had been someone else's problem a very long time ago. Now, officially, it was no one's. Christina hung up and stared down at the log again. This was supposed to be the end of it. A curiosity she bumped into during her research, something to mention in passing and then move past. But somewhere between that blank answer and those 3 words, a switch flipped. She opened Reddit. In a true crime corner of the internet where amateur sleuths, genealogists, and night owls gathered to pick apart missing person cases and unsolved murders, she wrote out what she had found. She described the record, the number, the Potter's Field burial. She described the call to the cemetery, the confirmation that nothing else had been done. She did not rant, exactly, but the frustration bled through. A woman was lying in an unmarked grave, reduced to a handful of words and a number, and no one in authority seemed to care. One comment became a thread. The thread became a small, digital ripple. Some people offered sympathy. Others asked questions. A few suggested places to call, agencies to contact. If the official channels were not going to move, maybe the unofficial ones would. Christina did something a lot of us never do. She followed through. She started making calls, not 1 or 2, a list. Strongsville Police Department. The detective sergeant. No luck. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office. Records. Administration. No luck there either. The Metro Parks Rangers, who had jurisdiction over the area where the remains had supposedly been found back in the 1970s. She left a voicemail. She was not optimistic about hearing back. She circled back to the cemetery. Maybe there was an old caretaker, an ancient ledger, some forgotten note in a file cabinet that could give her more than 3 words and a number. Most people would have stopped after the first dead end. The first, we do not have that here. The first, we are not sure who you should talk to. The world is full of quiet, unclaimed tragedies, and most of us learn to step around them. Christina kept going. One of those calls finally turned up something that changed everything. An autopsy report. Suddenly, this was not just a vague record in a burial log. This was a real case, with a real body, a real crime, and the kind of detail that makes your stomach drop. The report confirmed what Christina had already come to suspect. This was a homicide. The bones did not lie. When forensic experts had first examined the remains, all those years before, they had realized they were not dealing with a complete skeleton. Some bones were missing. The jaw, the entire mandible, was gone, like someone had taken it. Whether that was deliberate or the result of animals and weather over time, no one could say for certain. But it meant something critical. Any dental reconstruction would be limited. A vital part of her face, of her identity, was simply not there. Dr. Charles Hers, the assistant county coroner, had taken over the examination. He analyzed what he had: the skull, the remaining long bones, the partial teeth, the condition of the remains. From that, he could paint a rough picture. The victim was a young woman, most likely between 17 and 23 years old. She had been petite, standing around 5 feet 1 inch tall, and probably weighing between 100 and 110 pounds in life. She had not been lying by that riverbank for decades. She had likely been killed only months before those boys found her. Cause of death: a gunshot wound to the head, a single bullet through the skull. No name, no identification, just a story written in bone and trauma. Her body had been found half buried near a riverbank, close to railroad tracks. There were no clothes, no wallet, no jewelry, no purse. Nothing that could easily tie her back to a specific neighborhood, a workplace, a store. Whoever had left her there had made sure there was nothing obvious for police to latch onto. It was as if someone had gone out of their way to strip her of anything that could say, "This is who I was." But people do not just evaporate. Somewhere, at some point, she had been alive and known. Someone had given her a first name, a last name, a birthday. Someone had heard her laugh, argued with her, shared a kitchen or a classroom or a bus ride with her. People do not stop existing just because their paperwork gets misplaced. Back in 1975, when her bones were first pulled from the mud along the Rocky River Reservation, the case did get attention. For a while, 3 teenage boys had been out hiking when they noticed something pale sticking out of the earth near the riverbank. At first, it might have looked like driftwood or a stone caught in the mud, but the closer they looked, the more they saw fragments tangled in roots, shapes that did not belong in soil, bones. You would expect them to run straight to a phone, to call for help right away. They did not. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the strange, numb logic that takes over in moments when the brain cannot quite accept what the eyes are seeing. Eventually, the police were called. At first, officers were not even sure what they were looking at, a deer, some other animal. But when they uncovered the skull, there was no doubt. This was human. This had once been someone. They had to figure out who. The timing of the discovery dropped the case into an ongoing media storm. At that moment, America was obsessed with one particular missing young woman. Patricia Hearst, the granddaughter of publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, who had been kidnapped in February of 1974 from her apartment in Berkeley, California, by a radical group called the Symbionese Liberation Army. Her story was everywhere. First, she was the terrified heiress on grainy surveillance footage. Then the narrative twisted. Instead of a helpless captive, she appeared to join her captors. Reports surfaced of her participating in a bank robbery. Radio broadcasts, manifestos, blurry photos. The country watched the transformation with a mix of horror and fascination. At one point, there were alleged sightings of her in Ohio. And now, in Ohio, a young woman's remains had been found. The authorities had to ask the question, could this be her? The unidentified woman's estimated age, height, and general build did not immediately rule it out. A young woman, small in stature, discovered in the right general time frame. The attention was intense. An answer, either way, would make headlines. Dental records settled it. Patricia Hearst had distinct dental work. The skeleton from Strongsville had only 6 teeth remaining, 5 with fillings, but the patterns did not match. It was not her. Patricia Hearst was still out there, alive, a living spectacle moving through courtrooms and news cameras. The woman in the riverbank was someone else. After that, the momentum faded. Investigators searched what they could. They checked missing person reports. They tried to match her estimated age and physical description to any open cases in the area. According to the coroner's office, nothing fit. They said no one came forward with information. Eventually, a spokesman for the Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office admitted the obvious: they were out of leads. There was no new evidence coming in. The body had been badly decomposed, exposed to the elements near the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad tracks. Only 6 teeth remained. Without a clear dental match or an obvious missing person to tie her to, there was not much more they felt they could do. The case went cold. And then, a new problem took center stage. Not who she was. Who was going to pay to bury her? If that sounds grotesque, that is because it is. The news coverage that Christina later dug up from old archives made one thing very clear. For the people in charge at the time, the biggest question was not who killed this young woman, or even who is she. It was, who is financially responsible for her burial? The estimated cost was around $100. Strongsville, the town where the body had been found, said it was not their responsibility. Cleveland did not want it either. Cuyahoga County pointed back toward the municipalities. The welfare department said they only handled burials for veterans. The city's vital statistics office said it was a county matter. The county's Veterans Affairs office said that because the body was found in Strongsville, it was Strongsville's problem. There had allegedly been an agreement, sometime in the mid-1960s, that municipalities were responsible for facilitating the burial of people without funds. Whether that applied to unidentified bodies, nobody seemed eager to clarify. While officials shuffled paperwork and pointed fingers, her remains sat in limbo at the coroner's office. No name, no answers, and, apparently, no one willing to sign off on a bill that would have been less than the cost of a nice dinner for 2. Eventually, the decision was made. She would be buried in Potter's Field at Highland View Cemetery, the place where the unclaimed and unidentified were laid to rest. No marker, no stone. Just a grave among many, all of them belonging to people whose names did not make it onto anything permanent. White female bones. Woman 82483. For the next 40 years, that was her existence. A body in an unmarked grave. A line in an old logbook. A case file slowly being swallowed by dust and time. Until a genealogy student with a stubborn streak and an internet connection decided that was not good enough. Back on Reddit, Christina updated her thread. She had found the autopsy report. She had pieced together what little media coverage there had been. She had mapped out her next steps. She wanted to get this Jane Doe officially entered into NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. a federal database designed to connect unidentified remains with missing person reports. She planned to keep calling the Metro Parks Rangers, even if it felt like shouting into a void. She wanted to reach out to the Berea Police Department, the first agency originally called to the scene. She considered contacting the Western Reserve Medical Center, which had examined the skull, and the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office, on the off chance that some old record was still languishing in a box somewhere. Other users on the thread chimed in. Some were moved by the story. Others shared their own experiences, trying to get agencies to dig up old cases. One commenter wrote that what struck them most was how little of the original coverage focused on the woman herself. Instead, the headlines had revolved around the interbureaucratic bickering over who would pay to bury her. "It is heartbreaking," they wrote, "that the story was not about who she was, or whether she was murdered, but about who had to foot the bill." Another user asked if they could cross-post the information to an unidentified persons forum on another site, Web Sleuths, a well-known gathering place for people obsessed with solving cold cases from behind their keyboards. Christina agreed, asking only that they let her know when they did and that they gave credit. Soon, her Jane Doe was not just a stray line in a university library book. She was a topic of conversation among people who knew how to dig, how to cross-reference, how to pressure systems that did not want to look backward. Among them was a man who would quietly change everything. His name was Carl Koppelman. He was not a cop. He did not carry a gun or a badge. He did not have the power to subpoena records or kick down doors. What he had was, in many ways, more frightening. He had time, he had talent, he had an obsession with the lost. Carl was part of a growing, unofficial army of citizen detectives and forensic artists. People who were not paid to care, but did anyway. People who took their skills in genealogy, art, digital research, and data analysis, and pointed them at cases that law enforcement had quietly filed away. Using public records, DNA databases, online archives, and a deep tolerance for frustration, they had put names to faces that had been skulls and morgue photos for decades. Carl had helped with more than one of those. He had stared at the blurred features of the dead and tried to imagine who they might have been in life. He had seen what it meant when a Jane Doe finally got her real name back, how families who had lived in limbo for decades suddenly had a grave they could put flowers on. So when he saw Christina's posts, when he read about woman 82483, something in him clicked the same way it had for her. Here was a girl who had been murdered, buried, and then essentially erased from the official system. Her case was not even in NamUs. As far as the database of the missing and unidentified was concerned, she did not exist. And that, it turned out, was not some grand conspiracy. It was a typo. On Web Sleuths, Carl wrote about a conversation he had had with someone at the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's office, a woman named Ann Fisher. They had been talking about an entirely different case, another John Doe from the early 1980s. While he had her on the line, he asked about the Strongsville Jane Doe. She could not find anything under that category. When she dug a little deeper, she found the problem. In their system, the word unidentified had been misspelled in the case file. Because of that simple error, the case had not been tagged correctly. It did not show up with the other unidentified remains. It was invisible to the databases and, by extension, invisible to anyone trying to connect the dots between missing people and bodies in morgues and graves. One word, typed incorrectly decades earlier, had effectively erased her from the 21st century. Anne told Carl that once she realized what had happened, she started correcting it. She would send what information they had to NamUs and get an official case file set up. Strongsville Jane Doe, woman 82483, would finally be added to the system that should have had her from the beginning. It was a simple administrative fix. But in the world of cold cases, simple fixes can shift everything. Now, instead of living only in a buried coroner's file and a forgotten cemetery ledger, she would appear in one of the most important tools used by investigators and citizen sleuths alike. A face without a name could finally be matched to a name without a body. Christina had given her a push into the light. Carl was about to give her something else. A face. As part of his work, Carl had reconstructed the faces of several unidentified victims. One of his most haunting successes was the case of a girl known for decades only as Walker County Jane Doe, found murdered in Texas in the early 1980s. His careful reconstruction of her features helped keep her case alive until forensic genealogy finally gave her a name: Sherry Ann Jarvis. When Christina worried online that Strongsville Jane Doe might never get a proper facial reconstruction because of the missing bones, Carl saw a challenge, not a dead end. He studied the available information. The skull photograph Christina had managed to track down, the notes about missing teeth and the absent mandible, the trauma, the wear, the shape of the remaining structures. Then he did what he does best. He started to rebuild her, not as a perfect portrait, no reconstruction ever is, but as a plausible, human face, a face someone might recognize, a face that looked like it belonged to a real young woman who once walked through the world, rather than a cold forensic diagram. When he finished, he shared the image. For the first time in more than 40 years, the girl in the unmarked grave had more than a number. She had eyes, a nose, a mouth, a way for the living to look at her and feel something. And somewhere out there, in another set of records, another database, another family's memory, there was a missing girl whose story was going to collide with hers. A girl named Linda. Before we follow that collision, before we go back to the night she disappeared and the stepfather whose story never quite added up, remember this. This entire chain of events, from a grave in Potter's Field to a name on a headstone, started because one person would not ignore 3 words in a dusty book: white female bones. If you are still with me, it means stories like this matter to you too. Take a second to like this video, drop a comment, and make sure you are subscribed to Disturbed Intent with notifications turned on. It tells the algorithm that these forgotten cases deserve to be seen, and it helps us keep going down these rabbit holes. Because for the families left behind, and for the people buried without names, silence is not closure. And for one family in Akron, Ohio, the silence had already gone on for far too long. The reconstruction of a face is never really about bone and clay and technique. It is about defiance. Taking something that time tried to erase and insisting that it still matters, that someone still matters. And as Carl's reconstruction of the Strongsville Jane Doe began circulating through the small but relentless world of online sleuths, a slow shift started to ripple outward. Most of the time, these cases sit quietly in the corners of the internet, passed between a few determined people, like secret messages no one else bothers to read. But every so often, one face, one detail, one line in an autopsy report sparks something. And this one did. People began wondering aloud. Who had she been before she became bones in a riverbank? Who had lost her? Who had loved her? And why, after all this time, had no one come forward? It was a strange paradox. The woman buried under the number 82483 seemed forgotten by every official agency that should have been responsible for her. But among strangers, people who had never met her, people who were not alive when she died, she was becoming anything but forgotten. In the threads where Christina posted updates, speculation grew. Some users combed through old newspaper archives, looking for missing person cases from around the same time. Others checked the NamUs listings now that the Strongsville Jane Doe had finally been added. A few compared the reconstruction to long-missing teenagers from Ohio and surrounding states. Then, someone pointed out something subtle, something that would have been easy to miss if you were not the kind of person who spends your free time studying databases of the missing. A new listing: a missing young woman from Akron, Ohio. The entry had only recently been added to NamUs, despite the fact that she had disappeared in the 1970s. The timing of the listing was not a coincidence. Someone, maybe a relative, maybe a volunteer, had clearly been pushing to have her case recognized again. Her name was Linda Pagano, 17 years old, last seen in late summer of 1974, a few months before the body in Strongsville was found. Her height was listed slightly below the estimated range for the Jane Doe, but only slightly. Her build seemed similar, her age matched, and she had disappeared not hundreds of miles away, but within the same region of Ohio. When Carl saw the listing, something clicked. He wrote in the Web Sleuths thread that this new listing looks like a very good possible Strongsville Jane Doe. The timing, the age, the location, the vague circumstances, all of it lined up in a way that was almost too neat. But close enough is not good enough in forensics. You cannot give someone their name back based on coincidence. You need proof, hard, scientific proof. And for that, the authorities needed dental records. Linda had been listed as having extensive dental work. The Strongsville Jane Doe had 5 remaining teeth, all with fillings. If the patterns matched even partially, it would narrow the field from possible to probable. Carl contacted the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's office again. This time, they were already on the move. Akron police had also noticed the similarities between Linda's newly posted missing person file and the Strongsville remains. They were working to get dental x-rays. But before they could do that, they had to find something important: the Jane Doe's teeth, which meant they had to find her body. And that was harder than it sounded. For 40+ years, she had been lying in Potter's Field, a cemetery reserved for the unclaimed, the unknown, and the forgotten. But Potter's Fields are not laid out like traditional cemeteries. There are no neat rows of markers, no stones etched with dates of birth or death, just stretches of ground where bodies lie, with nothing to indicate who is beneath. Strongsville Jane Doe had been buried with no marker, no coordinates recorded in a way that modern systems could easily interpret. Decades of weather and soil shift had obscured any landmarks that might once have existed. Before the medical examiner could exhume her to gather DNA and dental samples, they needed to find her exact resting place. Digging in the wrong spot would not just be disrespectful, it would risk disturbing the remains of unrelated burials. They needed precision. Enter the University of Akron. Researchers brought in magnetic surveying equipment technology that could detect subtle variations in soil composition caused by burial disturbances. It was not a perfect science. It could not point and say, "She is right here." But it narrowed the search from acres of ground to manageable sections. The first attempt revealed human remains, but they were not hers. The second attempt found another burial. Again, not hers. It took multiple tries before one set of bones, carefully lifted from the ground and examined, appeared to match the characteristics recorded in the original autopsy report. This was her, woman 82483, her second time being pulled from the earth, her last. Samples were collected. Bone fragments and teeth were sent to the University of North Texas, one of the leading forensic labs in the country. Meanwhile, members of Linda Pagano's family provided cheek swabs for comparison. Because her soft tissue had long since decayed, they would not be comparing nuclear DNA, what most people think of when they imagine a modern genetic test. They would be analyzing mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through maternal lines, not as precise, but powerful enough to confirm relationships over large spans of time. The lab began its work, and then came the waiting. Anyone familiar with cold case investigations knows that waiting is its own kind of torture. DNA labs do not rush, especially when the samples are fragile and the stakes are high. Every step must be verified. Every finding must be checked again. Contamination is the enemy. Human error can undo months of careful work. Weeks turned into months. The online threads buzzed with quiet anticipation. Christina updated her posts whenever she could. Carl stayed in contact with the medical examiner's office. Linda's surviving family members held their breath, somewhere between hope and dread. Then, on June 29, 2018, the call came. The mitochondrial DNA was a match. Woman 82483 was Linda Pagano, the young woman who had been dismissed as a runaway. The girl whose brother had tried to tell police in 1975 that the Jane Doe in Strongsville was probably his sister. The girl whose disappearance was brushed aside with a shrug and an assumption. Found, identified, named. 44 years after she vanished. When Carl posted the update, he made it clear that although the authorities had already been considering the match, the entire chain of events existed because someone in a library decided not to look away from 3 words in a burial log. If not for Christina's tenacity, the case might still have been buried in a corrupted corner of a county database. For Linda's brother, Mike, the confirmation was surreal. He said, "I thought I would never hear this. I thought I would die, wondering." But behind that relief was something darker, something hollow. Because the truth was this. The family could have had their answer in 1975. Mike had called the police back then when he heard about an unidentified young woman found 30 miles away. He told them about Linda, her age, her size, her features, and according to him, they dismissed it casually. Said the Jane Doe was probably a little older, probably a little taller. They did not check dental records. They did not check missing persons reports thoroughly. They did not even take the time to consider what he was truly asking. A brother trying to find his sister. Had anyone looked closely, the match would have been obvious. Instead, decades passed. Evidence deteriorated. Witness memories faded. And the one man who had always been at the center of suspicion, Linda's stepfather, died in 1990, taking whatever he knew with him. But before we get to him, to the night Linda vanished, and the lies that were accepted without question, we have to go back. Back to who she was. Linda was not the kind of girl who simply ran away. Not the type to abandon her brand new Mustang, her job at A&W, her routines, her relationships. She did not have a history of disappearing. She did not have a reason to leave everything behind in the middle of the night. But that did not matter in 1974. Because one man, her stepfather, Byron Claflin, told police a story that made their lives easier, not harder. He said they argued. He said he kicked her out. He said she left. No bag, no clothes, no purse, no money, no car. Just left. It was a story so thin it should have crumbled under the slightest pressure. Instead, investigators accepted it at face value. There were no search teams, no interviews, no forensic examination of the apartment, no follow-ups. Case closed. A teenage girl vanished, and the official reaction was a bureaucratic shrug. But to understand how that could happen, you need to understand the 70s, the attitudes of the era. The way missing teenagers, especially teenage girls, were dismissed as runaways before anything else was even considered. It happened all over the country, again and again. And for Linda, that dismissal cost her everything: her identity, her investigation, her justice. While the authorities let her case slip through their fingers, her family never stopped searching. Her mother spent years hoping for a knock on the door that never came. Her siblings grew into adulthood with the ache of an unanswered question always at the center of them. Mike, her older brother, carried guilt that was not his to carry, the kind that gnaws at a person late at night, whispering, "What if?" But answers did not come. Not until a student with a hobby and a stubborn streak stumbled onto a forgotten number in an old book. Linda had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Her body found the same year she disappeared. Her family desperately searching while she lay unclaimed in a government field. Her brother trying to tell the police what they refused to hear. If someone had taken him seriously, the investigation might have actually begun when it mattered. But now, the question hanging over everything was the one that had haunted her family for almost half a century. Who killed her? And even more painful, could they have known, all those years ago, if the system had not failed her so completely? As Linda's name finally returned to her, a second story began to emerge inside the larger tragedy, one that would make the already painful truth even harder to swallow. Because the timeline, once reconstructed, pointed in one direction, back to the apartment she shared with her stepfather, back to the night of the argument, back to the man who told the original story that authorities accepted so easily, back to Byron Claflin. To follow that thread, we have to step into the night Linda disappeared. What the stepfather said, what the family always suspected, what the evidence suggests now, and what might have happened in the hours before she died. But that tale unfolds slowly. And it is not the kind of story that sits comfortably in the human mind. The night Linda Pagano vanished did not begin as a mystery. It began like countless other summer nights across Ohio in the 1970s: warm air, loud music, teenagers drifting from one place to the next, trying to squeeze out the last hours of freedom before another school year closed in. Linda had gone to a concert with her boyfriend. She was 17, responsible, steady, and not the kind of girl who made reckless, impulsive decisions. She had a job at A&W. She had a brand new Mustang she adored. She had routines, friends, a life full of pieces she would never voluntarily leave behind. And yet, when she returned home in the early morning hours of late August 1974, her path intersected with the one person who would become a dark gravitational force in the decades of silence that followed. Her stepfather, Byron Claflin. For years, he was the only person who could describe what happened in the moments between Linda walking through the front door and vanishing from the world. His version of events was thin, so thin it almost snapped under its own weight. He said, they argued, He said she came home too late. He said he was angry. And he said that he kicked her out. That was it. No details, no description of her clothing. No explanation for why she left her car behind. No mention of whether she took money or belongings or even shoes. According to him, she simply walked out the door, into the night, with nothing but whatever was already in her pockets, if anything was there at all. In the 1970s, this kind of story, however unbelievable, was often enough for police. Teenage girl, argument, ran away, case closed. Never mind that Linda had no history of running away. Never mind that she was financially stable, emotionally grounded, and tightly connected to her siblings. Never mind that she left behind a car that was practically her pride and joy. Never mind that she left her job, her clothes, her paycheck, her belongings, her entire life. The police accepted Byron's statement with no real pushback. And just like that, Linda's disappearance was quietly downgraded from emergency to inconvenience. Her siblings, however, knew instantly that the story did not make sense. Families know their own. They know patterns and habits, the subtle rhythms of daily life. They knew Linda would never walk out without her keys, or purse, or car, or planned destination. They knew that even if she was upset, she would not leave permanently without contacting someone. Her brother Mike began making calls. Phone calls to police, phone calls to friends, phone calls to tips lines. He created flyers and handed them out. He checked with local hospitals, local jails, social circles. He followed rumors that went nowhere. He reached out to anyone who might have seen someone resembling Linda on the streets that night. Every time he tried to engage authorities, he felt resistance. The case had already been labeled runaway. Everything after that was treated like an overreaction. But Mike kept going. It was Linda. What else was he supposed to do? Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Her bedroom remained untouched, frozen in the strange half-life of missing person cases where you do not know whether to preserve everything or start to let go. Her mother lived in a quiet, perpetual state of grief, hope, and dread, braided together tightly enough to hurt. But Byron went on with his life as though nothing catastrophic had happened in his house. According to some accounts, he offered conflicting details, shifting tones, small inconsistencies. Nothing overt enough to trigger action from police, but enough to unsettle Linda's siblings. Something about his manner was strange, detached, almost rehearsed. People who met him described him as hot-tempered, quick to anger, the kind of man who could go from irritated to explosive with very little warning. If that was how he behaved in public, it was hard not to wonder what he was like behind closed doors. Even so, Linda's disappearance never elevated beyond runaway. The police did not search the apartment. They did not canvass the neighborhood. They did not call in dogs. They did not examine her car for abandoned belongings or clues. No one asked neighbors whether they heard anything that night. There was no urgency, no scrutiny, no real investigation. For all practical purposes, no one with authority was looking for her. Then February of 1975 arrived. News emerged of an unidentified female skeleton found in Strongsville, about 30 miles from where Linda had been last seen. The remains were a young woman, petite, around Linda's age. No ID, no belongings. A homicide. To any reasonable person, this was an obvious possibility worth investigating. Mike knew it immediately. He called the police and asked whether the Strongsville remains could be Linda. The person he spoke with dismissed him almost instantly, said the Jane Doe was probably older, probably taller, probably not his sister. No request for dental records, no request for photos, no follow-up questions, no attempt to check the one known location where Linda's body would eventually be found. This would become one of the most devastating decisions in the entire case. Because the Strongsville Jane Doe was Linda, and she was discovered 6 months after she disappeared. Her family could have had closure in 1975, but instead, they were sent into a 44-year nightmare. The original investigators walked away. Byron Claflin went unchallenged. Linda's death was erased under layers of neglect, paperwork, and silence. And worst of all, the one person who could have provided the truth, or at least the missing pieces, lived out his life untouched. Byron died in 1990. Whatever he knew, whatever happened in that apartment during the early hours of that summer night, whatever words were said in anger or fear or something darker, they died with him. But sometimes, the truth tries to leak through even when someone works hard to bury it. Years later, as researchers and online sleuths pieced together Linda's timeline, a few things stood out sharply. If Linda had walked out voluntarily, she would have taken her car. If she had fled in fear, she would have called someone. If someone she trusted had offered to drive her somewhere, she would have left a trace. Nothing about her behavior that night aligned with the narrative of a runaway. People do not go from responsible teenager with a job and a social life to vanished skeleton in a riverbank without violence. Something had happened in that apartment. Something that precipitated her death. Maybe the argument escalated. Maybe something was said or done that could not be taken back. Maybe Byron lashed out. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he called someone. Or maybe he acted completely alone. We do not know. We may never know. But the pieces we do have are damning. Linda disappeared from the only place her stepfather controlled. No one saw her after she entered the apartment. The body was found not far from him, along a route someone familiar with the area might take. Byron never helped search for her. He never pushed for police involvement. He never pleaded for her safe return. He never acknowledged that something violent might have happened. He simply said he kicked her out and left it at that. Even Linda's siblings felt the truth, long before evidence confirmed it. They had lived with him. They had seen the volatility. They had seen the shifts in mood, the unpredictability, the simmering anger that lived just beneath the surface. And when Linda disappeared, their instinct pointed to the same place. The apartment, the man inside it, the argument that ended her life. But because the system dismissed Linda so early, because they mislabeled her as a runaway, because they ignored Mike when he tried to point them toward the Strongsville remains, the last possible chance to confront Byron evaporated. By the time her remains were finally identified in 2018, he had been dead for nearly 3 decades. There would be no charges, no interrogation, no confession, no justice. The only thing left was the truth assembled through the painful stitching together of timelines, witness memories, historical context, and the emotional instincts of a family who knew something was wrong the moment Linda did not come home. The night Linda disappeared is a void, like a black hole in the timeline. Everything before is normal. Everything after is tragedy. What filled the space between was secrecy and silence. But as painful as that truth is, the story does not end merely with Linda's identification. Because identification is not justice. It is the opening of a door. And behind that door are questions the original investigators never asked. Questions the public now demands to know. Questions that, even with Byron gone, must be articulated for the sake of honesty, history, and the memory of a girl who deserved better. And those questions begin with a deeper look into the investigation that never happened. The evidence that was ignored. The simple steps that were skipped. The decades-long chain reaction of failures that stripped a 17-year-old girl of her name, her case, and her chance at justice. In the weeks after Linda vanished, the people who knew her best were living in 2 different realities. Her family lived in a reality of dread, calling stations, posting flyers, retracing steps. Every morning, they woke up hoping for a new lead and fearing the worst. Every night, they went to bed trying to imagine where she might be. They kept her room just as she left it. They stared at her Mustang in the driveway, wondering why no one else found that abandoned car as chilling as they did. And then there was the police reality. A simple one. A convenient one. A runaway. Once that label was attached, it stuck like glue. It dictated everything. It allowed officers to bypass protocols, ignore inconsistencies, and avoid the time, effort, and resources required for a real investigation. It transformed a missing teenager into a case number that could be quietly moved off someone's desk. If Linda had been kidnapped, there would have been media coverage. If she had been murdered in her home, there would have been a crime scene. If she had been attacked by a stranger, there would have been urgency. Instead, the police took the path of least resistance. No interviews with neighbors. No collection of statements. No search of the home. No checks for blood or evidence. No forensics on her car. No canvassing. No timeline reconstruction. No attempt to corroborate Byron's story. With no pressure from authorities, potential witnesses never realized their memories mattered. Friends who might have noticed something off in the days leading up to the concert. Neighbors who might have heard shouting. People who might have seen Byron's movements that night. Individuals who might have seen a car parked near the Rocky River Reservation a few hours before dawn. All of it was lost. That kind of loss is not the kind you recover from. It is the kind that compounds with time. When the remains were found in Strongsville 6 months later, it should have been the break that brought Linda home. The skeleton matched Linda's build. The timing was right. The condition of the remains was consistent with someone who had died around late summer or early fall. But the misunderstanding that had taken root in August runaway had already poisoned everything. And then there was the call. That single devastating call where Mike Pagano told police that his sister, 17-year-old Linda, was missing, that she fit the description, that he feared it was her, and he was dismissed. The unidentified remains, he was told, were probably older, probably taller. No one bothered to check properly. No one bothered to verify. No one bothered to honor the simplest responsibility of all: listening. That one moment of dismissal had consequences that stretched across decades. Linda's body was never linked to her missing person case. Her autopsy was filed away under the wrong title. Her burial record was archived with a misspelled classification. Her grave was left unmarked. Her investigation, what little there was of it, was abandoned. In the years that followed, her family lived with a kind of slow, permanent ache. They never stopped wondering, never stopped searching. But with no evidence, no support, and no acknowledgement from authorities, they were left trying to solve something that had been solved already. They just did not know it. Linda's mother died in 2012, still hoping to find out what happened to her daughter. That is the quiet cruelty of cases like this. The truth exists buried in files, in soil, in memories, but it stays locked away by human indifference. As the years rolled on, the case fell completely off the radar. Even the physical records began to decay. Old files were moved, boxes mislabeled, documents misfiled, databases updated without legacy entries being checked. Technology evolved faster than the old information inside those cabinets. At some point, the system simply forgot her. And in an even stranger twist, her case technically did not exist inside the modern records at all. The word unidentified had been misspelled in her classification. One typing error. One small mistake made years earlier, maybe by a tired clerk or an overworked assistant. That error prevented her case from being digitally connected to the county's official list of unidentified remains. It froze her in time. Unfindable, unsearchable, unlinked. The medical examiner's office had her files, but the digital system did not. The NamUs database could not see her because the county had never forwarded the case. And the county could not see her because the file was not indexed correctly. A ghost created not by the mystery of her death, but by the monotony of administrative oversight. Year after year, her identity slipped further away. Not because she was truly unrecognizable, not because the evidence was too damaged, not because the case was unsolvable, but because no one ever went back to look again. By the early 2000s, the case existed underground, buried in archives and half-forgotten news clippings. A few paragraphs of newspaper text, a few lines in autopsy records, a few dusty ledgers in a cemetery office, all of it waiting for someone to ask the right question. And then, in 2018, 44 years after Linda disappeared, that someone finally arrived. Christina Skates, a student doing what thousands of others had done before her, reading cemetery records, sifting through handwritten logs, studying burial numbers, and cross-checking interment lists. The only difference was that she paused when she saw 3 words: white female bones. She did not know she was about to unravel a missing person case older than she was. She did not know that one single entry would pull her into contact with the medical examiner's office, online sleuths, one of the most respected forensic artists in the cold case world, and eventually a family waiting for answers for nearly half a century. She also did not know she was about to step into a bureaucracy so broken it had forgotten it was holding the answer. Her call to the cemetery revealed nothing. Her call to the police revealed nothing. Her call to the coroner revealed nothing. Her call to the Metro Parks Rangers revealed nothing. Her call to county administration revealed nothing. Every door she knocked on was locked. Every person she reached out to told her there was nothing more to find. But Christina did something that most people do not. She kept knocking. She kept asking. She kept pushing. At some point, determination becomes a weapon. And her persistence led her to something she was not supposed to find: an autopsy report confirming the remains were a homicide victim, a bullet hole in the skull, a young woman murdered. A case that had been considered solved only in the administrative sense. A case that had been dumped into Potter's Field without ceremony. She posted about it online. Others saw it. Carl Koppelman saw it. The typo was discovered. The case was pulled out of a digital black hole. The listing was submitted to NamUs. The reconstruction was done. Akron police noticed similarities to a missing girl newly added to the system. The cemetery was surveyed. The grave was located. The remains were exhumed. The bone samples were taken. The DNA was tested. The truth was confirmed. The chain reaction was unstoppable once it began. But that chain, as powerful as it became, exposed something heartbreaking. Had any one of these steps been taken in 1974 or 1975, Linda's body would have been identified within days or weeks. Her family would have been able to bury her. Investigators could have questioned Byron while he was still alive. Witnesses could have been interviewed while memories were fresh. Evidence could have existed that is now long gone. Instead, the case went cold before it even had a chance to warm. And so when Linda finally had a name again, when her remains were returned to her family and reburied under a proper headstone at Holy Cross Cemetery in Akron, Ohio, something else became painfully clear. Identification was closure, but it was also an indictment. A quiet accusation hanging over the entire system that failed her. Back in the 1970s, a police officer, one woman answering a phone in 1975, had the chance to change the future of this case. Had she taken Mike seriously, Linda's fate might have been known that year. The investigation might have opened. Evidence might have been gathered. Questions might have been asked. Even if Byron had lied or concealed something, law enforcement might have had a fighting chance to confront him. But that moment passed, and it never came again. Today, all that is left is a timeline we are forced to reconstruct in hindsight. A timeline made of gaps and shadows and speculation. Because the truth was never documented when it mattered most. Linda came home from a concert. An argument took place. She vanished within hours. Her body was found, shot in the head. She had been dead for months. Her stepfather told a story that made no sense. Authorities believed him without question. Her brother noticed the Strongsville Jane Doe and tried to sound the alarm. He was ignored. The remains were buried in a potter's field. Her details were misfiled. Her classification was misspelled. Her case vanished from the system. Her family suffered in silence. Her stepfather died in 1990. Her mother died in 2012 without answers. Her siblings aged with grief. And Linda waited, buried and nameless, until a student saw 3 words in a book. Now, though her killer may never stand in a courtroom, the story does not end there. Because one last piece still needs to be examined before we close this chapter. The question of motive. The question of opportunity. The question of truth buried inside the apartment where Linda lived. What evidence remains, even indirectly, that points toward what happened the night she died? And more importantly, what does justice look like when the person who likely caused her death is decades gone? When Linda Pagano finally got her name back after 44 years, the question that immediately rose to the surface, the question her family had whispered in private for decades, was the one that had no official answer. Who killed her? The medical examiner who performed Linda's autopsy in 1975 determined her cause of death: a single gunshot wound to the skull. A deliberate act, not an accident, not a runaway misadventure, not the random tragedy police tried to imply by labeling her disappearance a teenage impulse. Someone pulled the trigger. Someone disposed of her body. Someone made sure she disappeared from her own life. But the path to that answer is narrow now. Too narrow. Too much time passed without anyone asking questions. The investigation, what little existed, was neglected at its very birth. Evidence that could have pointed to the truth disintegrated, literally and figuratively, over decades. But even with the gaps, even with the dust and the missing files, the fragments that remain still form a shape. And that shape points back to the person Linda trusted the least, her stepfather, Byron Claflin. To understand why so many believe he was involved, you have to start with what is known, not what is speculated. Facts, not rumors. These facts, though imperfect, reveal a pattern. Linda was last seen alive entering the apartment she shared with him. No one saw her after that. She did not take her car. She did not take her purse. She did not take clothes or money or keys. Her beloved Mustang, practically her identity as a teenager, was left untouched. No one reported seeing her walk away from the complex. No evidence ever suggested she called a friend to stay with. No reason existed for her to vanish willingly in the middle of the night. The only person who gave a story about her final moments was Byron. He claimed he kicked her out for coming home late. He claimed she walked away without belongings. He claimed she left on her own. Suspicious does not begin to describe it. Her siblings had known for years that something felt wrong. They had seen his temper, his unpredictable moods. They saw how quickly arguments could escalate. They saw how hard it was to challenge him without consequences. Even people outside the family described him as volatile. And then there was the timing. The argument happens. Minutes later, Linda disappears forever. What kind of 17-year-old leaves her home with nothing except fear and shock, never to contact anyone again? And what kind of parent does not immediately panic when their teenage daughter does not return, does not call police, does not call friends, does not search? But Byron did none of that. He simply stuck to the story he offered once and never expanded. There is also the geography. Linda was found roughly 30 miles from the apartment. Not across the country, not across the state. A short drive. A route someone familiar with the area could easily take without drawing attention. It was a place remote enough for a body to go unnoticed for months, but not so remote that someone unfamiliar would naturally end up there in the dark. When you line up the facts, the image becomes harder to ignore. A secluded area. A body disposed near railroad tracks. A single bullet wound. A lack of belongings. And above all, silence. More than 4 decades later, the official status of Linda's case remains unsolved. But investigators, forensic genealogists, and citizen detectives who have looked at the timeline agree that one thing is almost impossible to dispute. Linda did not die at the hands of a stranger. Her death was not a coincidence. It was close to home, right behind her front door. And the one suspect who made sense, the one person the police should have questioned, should have visited, should have interrogated, was never held accountable. Because the system did not give Linda a chance, by the time anyone tried to reconstruct the truth, Byron was nearly 30 years dead. There would be no confession, no arrest, no courtroom, no charges, no answers. All that remained were questions, anger, and the hollow knowledge that justice was stolen not by cunning, but by indifference. Yet something emerged from the ruins of this case, something that mattered in ways no one expected. A movement. The unraveling of Linda's story showed, painfully and clearly, the growing power of ordinary people, the genealogists, the online sleuths, the amateur researchers who refused to accept cold case as the same thing as unsolvable. Linda was identified not because a detective reopened the case, but because a student refused to ignore 3 words in a forgotten book. Christina Skates, the woman who started everything by refusing to let go. When she first opened that burial record and saw white female bones listed with no name, she felt something turn inside her, a discomfort that became curiosity, curiosity that became determination, determination that became a force strong enough to undo decades of bureaucratic failure. She contacted agencies, tracked down records, posted online, networked with strangers, and eventually caught the attention of the one person who could give the forgotten Jane Doe a face. Forensic artist and citizen detective Carl Koppelman. Carl, who built reconstructions from skull shapes and fragments of history. Carl, whose digital artistry had helped identify one victim after another. Carl, who had once drawn the face of Walker County Jane Doe before she became known as Sherry Ann Jarvis. His reconstruction of Strongsville Jane Doe of Linda became the turning point, not because it was perfect, but because it made her human again. It showed investigators and the public that the girl in the unmarked grave was not just a case number or an administrative burden. She had a face, a life, a story, and that made everything else possible. The typo in her classification eventually came to light. The listing reached NamUs. The University of Akron surveyed the cemetery. The grave was found. The remains were exhumed. DNA was tested. Linda got her name back. A story that had been dead for decades came roaring back to life. Her siblings, older now, grayer now, finally got to bury her properly. A headstone, a service. Words spoken aloud, tears shed not for the unknown past, but for the known truth. Her mother never lived to see this day. Her stepfather never lived to answer for it. But Linda herself was no longer lost. She went from white female bones to Linda Pagano. From woman 82483 to a daughter, a sister, a teenager with a car she loved and plans she never got to fulfill. In September 2018, Linda was laid to rest under her real name at Holy Cross Cemetery in Akron, the place she should have been buried in the first place, the place her family could finally visit without the crushing weight of uncertainty. And while the law may not bring closure, truth has its own kind of justice. The legacy of Linda's case stands as a warning of what happens when investigators dismiss missing girls without effort, of what gets lost when bureaucracy replaces compassion, of how close cases can come to disappearing forever if no one fights for them. But it is also a reminder of something else, something powerful, something hopeful. A single determined person can resurrect the forgotten. A single conversation can reopen a 40-year-old grave. A single post on Reddit can lead to DNA tests that rewrite history. The truth does not disappear. It waits. Sometimes buried, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes ignored. But it waits for someone stubborn enough to look again. Linda's story proves that. And as long as people like Christina keep looking, as long as forensic genealogy continues to evolve, as long as citizen detectives refuse to stay quiet, then stories like hers will not fade anymore. The nameless will have names, the lost will be found. And those buried without identity may one day be returned to their families. Before we close tonight's story, if you are still with us, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment for the algorithm, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us bring more cases like this to light, cases forgotten, ignored, or buried under the weight of time. Because here at Disturbed Intent, we believe something simple. If a person lived, they deserve to be remembered. If a life was stolen, the story deserves to be told. And if there is still a question left unanswered, then silence is not an option. Thank you for watching.